Nah, no takers? Okay. Okay, I'm here with my friend Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. He is a historian and a Baptist, and he run his channel, Praise of Folly, where he discusses things that generally interest him. Today, we're going to talk about the Vietnam War, the taunts, and generally the culture, the paradigm shift in the 1960s and 70s. So, how are you, Todd?
I'm doing good. How are you, Volt?
Fine. So, so what's your analysis of the Vietnam War and how America gradually got involved?
Well, we got to start from the beginning. The Vietnam War was the result of the fallout of World War II. So Japan conquers French East Indochina, and during that time period, uh, as well as in China, we funded the communist forces, um, which is a big mistake. And this all goes back to my long-running argument that the war with Japan was pointless and stupid because, in the end of the day, Asia just went to the communists. But once we ended the war, then France was in charge of all of Vietnam. And within the next 10 years, it lost an insurgency against the North Vietnamese, which then divided the country in two. Now, basically at the end of the treaty with France and North Vietnam, there was two criteria. One was that there would be some sort of plebiscite in the late 50s to decide what South Vietnam would do. And also Laos and Cambodia were declared as neutral nations. Now, a lot of leftists will complain that the plebiscite in South Vietnam was never allowed to happen. But North Vietnam was acting in bad faith because Laos and Cambodia were secretly invaded between 1956 to 1960. So they had already totally disregarded the point here. And it looks like we have lost our guy. So, yeah, but I guess to just double down on it, the French, being in control of Indochina was sort of the gateway to Southeast Asia. So when Japan and later the communists wanted to gain control of Indonesia, they had to go through Indochina. And the Japanese were, controlling Indochina in order to use it as a springboard to get into Indonesia. And the communists had similar goals. But the long and the short of it is the war with Japan was a mistake, which gave rise to communism in Indochina. And the communists in Indochina were acting in bad faith. So that's why the Western powers didn't follow through with the plebiscite.
Yeah, and after all, if you ever read Kissinger's Diplomacy,
I have not.
okay, it's actually like a it's a decently well written, well argued book, but he has several chapters on Vietnam. Naturally, he does, and he sort of just go over is that it was America's Wilsonian tradition that sort of just embroiled the Vietnam to eventually led to this rather to this tragedy of Vietnam. Even though it was part of that mode of thought, no, basically promoting self determination. But in the end, they end up supporting a really corrupt and unpopular government in South Vietnam, and also they also understood by the time of the Nixon administration, after Johnson and Kennedy pretty much exhausted all their options, they understood that they needed to extricate America from Vietnam, well, rather through controversial means, as we all know. So, my reason why I want to talk about this is because it sort of marked the shift of the change and tone in American politics as congressional politics became more rigid and more basically more inflexible over time. And also culturally speaking, you see this rather generational revolt, and also these these big university riots that they had, and also several other moments. It was really a big time of polarization in America. In America, you have basically a war that's killing about 1,000 Americans a week, and they're seeing this on newspaper, the news media, and they're also seeing basically a breakdown of legitimacy with the government, partly due to Watergate and other factors. It's more of a big. It was more of a crisis legitimacy for people who are trying to govern the nation, and also maintaining their credibility abroad as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, so what I'm trying to get at is that how basically the American right at the time pretty much lost all semblance of control in their values, just sort of marked a shift in more, let's say, more libertine val- value in a social system. It was more of a reestablishing of a new social contract with their, with their government. Just
Yeah. Well, the sort of social change. Well, the sort of social changes that you're discussing, of course, did sort of predate Vietnam, at least large scale American activity, which is generally considered around 1965, with I think it was Da Nang, but we see that the on the one hand, have you seen like the Yuri Bezmenov videos on YouTube?
no.
So he was like a Soviet spy who defected to the West, and he talks a lot about subversion, how the communists infiltrated Western institutions in order to subvert them, to make them vulnerable to defending themselves. And he mentioned he pinned he. This is like I think from like the 80s, the actual original recordings, but it's about destroying their will to exist, their will to continue, which we begin to see already happening in Vietnam. And unlike, say, in World War II, where the United States obviously suffered larger casualties, or even Korea, where if you look at the amount of casualties suffered in Korea, it's about as many as in Vietnam, even though Korea only lasted like 2.5 years and Vietnam was like 10. I think one of the reasons why Vietnam became increasingly unpopular is it was a long war that didn't really bring a decisive victory. Right after that point, the Americans had been used to decisive victories. Korea wasn't a decisive victory, but it was short enough, in part, that I think a lot of Americans weren't as concerned about that. And a lot of World War II veterans were still alive and fought in Korea as well. But the fact that Vietnam dragged on without any clear end in sight, when we were told right before the Tet Offensive that, oh yeah, Westmoreland, oh yeah, we're at the light at the end of the tunnel. And then all of a sudden, the biggest NVA offensive of the war takes place. We're like, oh yeah, it's not near the end. And also with embedded with reporters being able to film combat, this is the first time Americans got to see actual combat firsthand. And I think also that was a factor as well.
Right, right. Also, there was by the time of the Nixon administration, when he campaigned on ending the Vietnam War, he what do you think of the talks that Nixon purposely sabotaged the peace talks in 1968? Do you think there's some validity to that?
I have really no comment. I don't really know enough about the topic.
Okay. Okay, and so basically Nixon promised to extricate Vietnam. I guess one of the most misguided criticisms of Nixon that he prolonged the war by about 3 to 5 years, I believe. And also he expanded the war into Cambodia and Laos. But from several accounts in the administration, he basically had no choice to expand the war into Cambodia and Vietnam, since he wanted rather concessions from the North Vietnamese. North Vietnam basically invaded Cambodia um, by forming centuries military networks into the country and you know, using it as a base of sorts. So that's why you have like bombing, harsh bombing campaign, which turns out was really indiscriminate, killed a bunch of civilians, as we know from the opening of archive rate, from the opening of the archive since the Clinton administration, and and other things. But to get to the heart of the matter is that one of the things I will probably will get one of the reasons I will praise Nixon on is basically just ending trying to end the war. Like he was actively trying to end the war, not trying to prolong it, but he was more so just trying to demand concessions for the North Vietnamese. That's and as a result, we end up having the Paris Peace Agreements in 1974 that turned out to be extremely rigid due to the congressional restrictions from the McGovernite Congress. So,
Well, and also the North Vietnamese acted in bad faith because as soon as the U.S. armed forces left, they invaded South Vietnam and took Saigon in 1975.
ex- exactly. So, the main point I want to drive home is that it was at the time when the debate at home became really toxic. Basically, America was psychologically exhausted from Vietnam, and Nixon, as we know, wanted to China, focusing with the reapproach of China and basically the SALT talks with the Soviet Union. It as a result of the crisis of legitimacy and also Watergate, we saw basically a breakdown of democracy internally in America. And I think since then we haven't really recovered to that same high trust type. Thomas Sowell mentions in one of his recent books, Discrimination and Disparities, about two black tales of two blackouts, both happening in New York City. In 1965, there was basically no looting when the blackout happened, and by a decade later, there was basically looting. It was basically marks a decline of civil society and trust. And I think Vietnam and the Watergate scandal was one of the main factors of this breaking down of civil society.
Well, during World War II and immediately after, there was a lot of trust in the U.S. government. Uh, People were very, I guess you could say, naive, but they trusted the U.S. government implicitly. So from FDR to Truman to Eisenhower to JFK to beginning with Johnson, because he did not run for re-election due to increasing scandals. But Johnson and Nixon, due to the scandals that surrounded their presidency, began to undermine the credibility of trust that people have in the U.S. government. Ford and Carter didn't really restore the trust. You could say maybe Reagan did a little bit, but that there was this fundamental shift where people just did not trust the government like they used to. And I think these actions, as both internal scandals and scandals in Vietnam, especially the fact that Vietnam was engaged under false pretenses, was, as we now know, the Tonkin Gulf incident, not only didn't happen as described, but just didn't happen at all.
Hmm. So, so what? So, what is your main takeaway from the 1960s and ongoing to the 70s? What to you? What fundamentally broke America as we know it?
Well, the sort of cultural changes that you're describing. Now, obviously, the alt right likes to point to the ethnic changes, but even if we look at the Immigration Act of 1965, when that was passed, America was still like 90% white, and these social changes were happening in a majority white country. So the racial changes in the past 50 years are a symptom of a cause that already happened earlier. Now, I think one of the key features here is that in 1948, Alfred Kinsey published Sexuality in the Human Male, which basically was a bombshell that totally changed America's view of sexual behavior. Now, it was, of course, entirely fraudulent. He included in his pool of samples of American males, criminals, pimps, gangsters, prison inmates, without necessarily differentiating. And without going into the details, look at table 34, he's basically describing full-on Mengele style child torture. It's pretty depraved if you look at his book and look up table 34. And when you really realize what table 34 is describing, this guy basically hired pedos to rape children. And under these false pretenses, he's able to say that, oh, well, people are far more promiscuous than we were led to believe, which then was used by liberals to convince state governments to loosen laws on the books on human sexuality. And, of course, paved the way for Playboy, which I think is 1954, was the first issue of Playboy. So, the other aspect too with Kinsey is that a lot of, since this was all illegal research he was doing, people would basically, in the whole standard of evidence is very unscientific. These were not controlled experiments. People would write into Kinsey saying that they basically molested their children, and he had no way of verifying under what conditions this information was gathered. And yet, that's what we ran with. And then in the late 50s, early 60s, we had the Marxist Freudians, Wilhelm Reich and Herbert Marcuse, which pushed the idea that, it was sexual repression that gave rise to fascism. We had, what was it? The Authoritarian Personality, which came out. And speaking of a conflict of interest, was funded by the American Jewish Association. And then it claims that anti-Semitism is a pathology. So a Jewish organization is paying for this communist material, which then says that it's a pathology to be anti-Semitic. That's like a conflict of interest if ever there was one. So it was a full court press from 1948 to 1960 by internally the Rockefellers. They were the ones that financed Kinsey, and then Marxist elements to liberalize American views of sexuality. The reason why the corporate interests did it was because they wanted to be able to solve the problem as they saw it of overproduction. They wanted people to continually buy things they didn't need. And in the 1920s, the president of Lehman Brothers writes in a book that they're going to manipulate people's fear of security and sexual inadequacy to sell them stuff they don't need. So we see the corporate angle there. And the communist angle is that, well, if you can undermine Christianity, the Frankfurt School narrative, Christianity is what inoculated the working class against communism. And a kind of sexual revolutionary activity would undermine Christianity and pave the way for a world proletariat. And so these two things working in concert fundamentally change America's view of cultural norms. It doesn't just affect sexuality, it affects Christianity and conservatism and traditional values, all of which this is a sort of a stab at the heart of.
So now that state enforced homosexuality. Okay, but I just had to say that. But anyway, so you're saying it's just basically the agenda. It was basically agenda of a variety of interest groups pushing this basically for a variety of different reasons, right?
Exactly.
Okay. As a result, we see like more of a libertarian shift in culture, and we see that now that hasn't really strengthened America as a civil society as a whole. It's more so just weaken it as a whole. too. And on back to the international scene, when when Nixon was in office, we I guess one of the most unique factors about Nixon presidency is more about how he conducted world politics. I think he has a very, let's say, paleo-conservative view. I think Pat Buchanan was, despite him being a isolationist or other, despite him being more skeptical of American power, I think he can agree to Nixon foreign policy at the time since he ran two books about him. And so basically, what's your view on detente, the relaxation of tension with the Soviet Union and China?
Well, from the point of view of ending the war in Vietnam, since much of Vietnam's supplies came overland through China, in order to put pressure on North Vietnam to end the war, Nixon had to cut at their support from China. So there's a certain, of course, practical utility in doing that. And since the Soviet Union and America had such large nuclear arsenals, I think in general, avoiding a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union at this point was definitely a good idea because the results would have been a nuclear exchange, which once it began would be difficult to limit.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. Also, from while Kitchener was office, he gave a speech. It was about turning. It was about, he said in his own words, it was about turning a ideological conflict into a constructive effort to build a new world. And quote unquote. So pursuing, let's say, SALT, the strategic. I just call it so. I don't remember the whole acronym, but also permitted he as an end result, it pretty much allowed America to remain on top because they exploited the Soviet Union like basically military backwardness and basically the how um how unreliable their computer technology was while allowing them to modify their own missile and defense things. I can't talk right now. Um, bas- Basically, in the end, the salts was in favor of Americans. That's the heart of the matter here. And afterwards, are you familiar with Henry Jackson or Scoop Jackson?
No, I'm not.
Okay. As a prop thing is, he basically formed a rather, he's basically a proto neoconservative or was a neoconservative. So he was not in favor of the strategic arm limitation talks, the first one. So he had the Jackson, so he formed a conservative coalition to enact the Jackson Valak Amendment, basically demanding strategic numerical equality with the missile defenses, and also permitted Soviet Jewish immigration. That that's that was his main role in that. He was one of the main factors of undoing detente, and Carter put the nail on it. Sort of put the nail on it, but it was also really the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 that also officially put the end of detente as well.
Yeah,
But even,
go ahead, sir.
oh, what are you about to say?
No, go ahead.
Okay. As we know now, as we know now, at its peak when Nixon, well, not Nixon, but when Kissinger was at his power around, at the height of his power around 1973 and 1974, we saw the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War or the Six Weeks War or the October War between Israel and Egypt. And was Syria also involved in that?
Yeah, Syria was also involved.
Okay. Okay. That was sort of the taunts operating at his best, and also show a weakness of the taunt as well. Whereas at its best, it basically the United States convinced the Arab world to expel the Soviet Union and their proxies. And also it shows that Egypt, as a autonomous power, was able to outmaneuver the Soviet Union and the United States. there in his recent history in his book, John Lewis Gates, the Cold War professor, or yeah, him. He wrote a biography of my George Kennan, who's my profile pic right now. Wrote a book called A Cold War: The New History, and he noted that with Egypt outmaneuvering the United States and the Soviet Union, it spelled a big weakness to the time to show how fragile it was in and of itself. And he criticized Kissinger when he wrote his recounting of it in his memoir of saying that you not that Nixon and him pretty much planned on it, it but he said there's no real evidence for that to convince Sadat, that's his name, right? Sadat, the Egyptian president.
Yeah, Sadat.
Yeah, Sadat, to to expel the Soviet Union. It was more of his own vindication, also the maneuverability of middle powers to do so. One of the main assumptions of the time that basically the two superpowers can pretty much control their sphere influence without impunity, but with Egypt pretty much demonstrating that they have autonomy and they can make their own decisions. It's just spelled a big weakness in that grand strategy. That's the trying to say there.
Mm-hmm. And as we saw in the 70s and 80s, the non-aligned parties became increasingly more influential. Obviously, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan turned a lot of third world groups against the Soviets. They had generally been like India and had been sort of soft on the Russians. In fact, they'd been seeing eye to eye in the Third Indo-Pakistani War. But with the invasion of Afghanistan, the Soviets that was a big geopolitical disaster for the Russians. Not only did they lose that conflict, a lot of their political allies around the world turned against them.
Yes, just again, looking at the comments for a bit, but anyway, I guess one of the big geopolitical, so basically the 70s was basically like victory for the United States or victory for the Soviet Union. Also on China, where they were when on China though, when Nixon decided to reapproach China, opening to the West, or basically as he put it, opening allowing China to join the community of nations in his own terminology. He was basically he was playing the long game because he knew that having a big industrial power such as China on the side of the United States and rest will be a big strategic blow to the Soviet Union in the long run of things. And they also benefited economically speaking. They also benefit, culture exchanges. It was a big win for the United States in the wrong run of things, but as we head to the 21st century, we are kind of seeing the loss of those gains since there's no common adversary, there's no common enemy to basically outmaneuver, like such as the Soviet Union, or containing a regional conflict such as Vietnam and Cambodia, and basically Indochina as a whole. We're losing those gains, but at the time it was a big success, a big breakthrough at the time.
Well, yeah, at the time, breaking the Sino-Soviet alliance was a big deal. And of course, during the 70s and 80s, the Soviets had more military assets deployed on the Chinese border than against NATO, which shows you how seriously they viewed the Chinese threat. Furthermore, we got Vietnam mired in Cambodia. So Chinese and the United States funded Pol Pot in the 80s. What was left of his regime. And we collaborated in Afghanistan against the Soviets. Everybody likes to talk about U.S. aid to the Afghans, but China supplied a great deal of material as well. And then China kind of won a coup against the Soviets in Rhodesia, where their backed force led by Mugabe took over instead of the Soviet-backed forces. So the Chinese were beginning to make some serious gains as well.
as well. So what is the main what have we learned today, Charlie Brown? What is the takeaway of the international scene of basically having pursuing the time and reopening China, and also basically seeing the decline of that grand strategy in the United States of relaxation and protection.
Well, in the short term, it was successful. It brought down the Soviet Union, and China played. That's what's interesting, right? China's role is often ignored, but in Afghanistan, which is really the graveyard of the Soviet Union, China was very influential. It was geographically much closer, and contributed a lot of material as well. So it's not just U.S. efforts in Afghanistan that led to the defeat of the Soviets, as well as tying down troops in the far eastern provinces. But just like with supporting the Mujahideen, which indirectly gave rise to Osama bin Laden and the international terrorism, China itself is becoming increasingly problematic in the South China Sea with their man-made islands and territorial disputes with Vietnam and the Philippines. And of course, it's all come full circle now because now Vietnam is seeking a military alliance with the United States against China. So, yeah, it's very strange how that turned out.
Yeah. You think it's kind of inevitable, like Vietnam siding with the U.S. against China, because historically they did not always have the best relationships since the Chinese conquered Vietnam several times in its history.
Well, yeah, and in 1978, they attempted to invade Vietnam again and failed. So, China and Vietnam being allies in the late 60s, early 70s was kind of ahistorical. I mean, Vietnam might have been a vassal to China after being invaded, but generally they didn't get along very well either. And they needed someone to protect them. Initially, it was the Soviets. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, the only other nation they could turn to was the United States.
Mm. Why everything comes full reverse in the long run of things?
Well, the
Uh,
United States has a pretty crummy track record of interventions. We often intervene in a place and it gets worse. Afghanistan is a case in point.
Although Afghanistan is kind of in the graveyard of empires for the majority of its history. I mean, the British tried to take over Afghanistan. It was a big embarrassment for them. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, yeah. I mean, it was bad for the British as well. But I think also you were one of the things also about I guess the détente is you were mentioning how it was taking advantage of the Soviets' lack of industrial development and computer technology. Uh, how exactly? Can you explain that again?
Okay, it's okay. One of when they were negotiating the strategic arm limitation talk back then, it was like a 3 year negotiation, but Nick Kissinger pretty much allowed a slight a slight numerical edge in returns of missiles, such as allowing them to have hot, allowing them to have like more ABMs or more ISMBMs, whatever. But he justified that as saying the United States has the ability to modernize their defenses to keep in parity with the Soviet Union. That's
Oh, I see. Yeah, because our weapons are better than the Soviet weapons. By keeping parity, we win.
yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, I'm slightly unclear. Sorry, I was kind of jumbling my words there.
That's okay. No, I see that now. Yeah, Nixon on the international level was actually quite successful in getting what he wanted. You also mentioned Egypt earlier, and even though Egypt militarily lost the Yom Kippur War, just like North Vietnam militarily didn't win a single battle, it didn't matter because, like North Vietnam, Egypt won. It got Sinai, it got Suez, which prior to Yom Kippur had been owned by Israel as a war booty from the Six-Day War. So,
And expel the Soviet Union from the Middle East for the time being.
and also put Egypt in a commanding position, culminating in the negotiations in 1978 with Israel.
Mm-hmm. What's that? The Camp David Accords under Carter.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, Jimmy Carter. I actually really like Jimmy Carter. He's kind of underappreciated, but okay, let's. I didn't plan to get into the 80s, but it's kind of that seems to be the natural course of this conversation.
Well, the natural course of this conversation is Afghanistan, the Soviet Vietnam.
Yeah, yeah,
I think
yes.
what Afghanistan demonstrates is that while Vietnam was a no-win situation for the United States, the U.S. political system was more resilient than the Soviet political system, and a defeat like that we could rebound from. But the Soviets, with their defeat in Vietnam, Afghanistan, they couldn't rebound from. You know what I mean? So I think the other thing too is it's interesting because much like the United States and Vietnam, the Soviets won most military engagements in Afghanistan. It's just that if you think about it, Afghanistan borders I think Pakistan, China, and Uzbekistan, and oh no, Uzbekistan is part of the Soviet Union, and Iran. And so it's pretty much impossible for the Soviets to close the borders, where so they couldn't prevent supplies from getting in.
Hmm. What was Carter's security advisor name? Brunetsky? Brad,
Oh
it's
yeah,
something
um,
something
Berlin
Polish.
was it Berlinski?
Yeah, Brunetsky. He actually thought that he basically predicted that the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan was gonna turn quote unquote Vietnam for them. And as we saw, he was right. Right, and also kind of exposed once again Russia's military weakness in terms of technology and their development. Also, Afghanistan is a very rigid terrain. It's a very, I believe, mountainous terrain. So they couldn't really, um, um, when you're a foreign invader, and you're basically placed on the defense, you have the home field advantage. You're able to take advantage of the environment and able to use basically guerrilla warfare tactics on them, while the Soviets use very conventional military warfare. I guess that's one of the strengths of guerrilla warfare as a military strategy, because the point is not winning, it's a point of just constant disruption and also just exhausting your enemy psychologically speaking as well.
Yeah, because eventually, like in Vietnam and Afghanistan, the occupying forces they're not able to get a knockout blow and they lose support at home. The key distinction was the United States did not rely on the military to maintain political dominance internally, whereas the Soviet Union, being a military dictatorship, could only maintain power if it had the loyalty of the armed forces. And the disaster in Afghanistan and the treatment of veterans returning from Afghanistan more or less was a fatal blow to Soviet internal power because they couldn't rely on the military to be their internal security forces after that.
Hmm. Then Reagan came along with his slick hair and smooth and charming manner. I
The
was
Gipper.
thinking, oh, okay, yes. I was trying to be a little funny here, but On the Gipper, Reagan, I kind of view the 80s as basically it was also considered to be the rise of neoliberalism, but it was also a rise, it also was a rather big conservative reemergence with Thatcher and Reagan in power. And it was basically a re-establishment of legitimacy, a re-establishment of trust with your government, with the beliefs, with free market beliefs, such as cutting the tax rate, deregulation, privatization, and all that, which is was a big factor of the 1980s politics well into the 90s under Bush and even the Clinton administration. It was a big reversal of trends, despite Nixon being a um, he was politically centrist, like basically a Rockefeller Republican. He basically following the school of Keynesianism, so he was more willing to have more government interventions in the economy, such as implementing price controls or rather or miraculously taking America off the Bretton Woods system or letting it collapse, while the 80s was more of a stabilization period for American politics at home and also for British politics at home too. And also internationally speaking, it was also a big escalation in tension as well, with Reagan basically pursuing military buildups, arm race, and taking advantage of the Soviet weakness at the time.
Yeah, the because ultimately, well, the Soviet collapse was due to multiple factors.
Yes, yes, but
Even if the Soviet Union hadn't collapsed in 1991, U.S. computer technology and advanced manufacturing was leaving the Soviets in the dust. So their large armed forces would have resembled the sort of Chinese, this large bloated army with obsolete equipment that going into the 2000s would have left the Soviets uh, ultimately just not really competitive militarily. Of course, they collapsed before that eventuality.
it's well on the Soviet Union or in Eastern Europe. Soviet Russia in general always been a rather strange place with a unique history. But I guess one of the outcomes of having like a communist or Marxist system is that they also saw a massive decline in life expectancy. About 5 years, I believe. The life expectancy in 1978 was, I believe, was around 70, and it was declining to around 65 to 64. That was a rather odd phenomenon. The Soviet Union as the Soviet Union as a industrial power, one of the main weaknesses of their economy was agriculture and also maintaining a large military and also basically coordinating 60 million prices to sets every single year. It was a very autarkic system. It was a very autarkic system, and it was basically found to fail due to its impracticality and inefficiencies over time. Yeah.
Exactly. And not only that, because the Soviet Union, as a military dictatorship, had to rely on the military, not only to keep its own people in line, but also the Eastern Bloc countries and threaten the West, large standing armies are expensive. And unless you have a robust enough economy to maintain them, they become a terminal drain on your society that prevents you from developing more advanced technologies and modes of production.
Hmm. One after World War II, America grand strategy was obviously containment, but also foster an international system that allows the development of capitalism, markets everywhere. It I guess America is not good with military power. It's not good with directing that type of hard power, but it's really good at pursuing economic grand strategies, like allowing markets. markets, and also basically just build a world that everybody's rich and they basically have no reason to go to war to each other at all.
Well, yeah, I mean, by the mid 1970s, given the rising standard of living and economic opportunities with the United States, the Soviet Union was a less desirable ally for China. Furthermore, they shared a common border with the Soviet Union, so they were more of a direct threat to the Chinese than were the United States.
Hmm. So, a little off track. What do you think of George Kennan? My profile picture right now.
He's my homie. I love George Kennan.
Ooh. Okay, I think it's appropriate to bring him to the discussion since he was pretty much alive. And actually, it's amazing how long he lived. Well, to see all the events unfold. And his perspective was that, of course, he was heavily critical of the Vietnam War. He was also he was also at the time supportive of the Marshall Plan, also supporting aid, supporting Truman to give aid to Greece and Turkey to resist communism. But by the 1950s, the late 1950s, he pretty much changed his mind on containment or how the United States militarized containment with NATO. He also changed to view Vietnam as basically a quagmire. He even testified in Congress saying, "Oh, I don't remember the exact quote, but just saying that it's good to liquidate unsound positions." That was basically the quote he gave out.
Hmm.
So,
What I like about Kennan is he's an advocacy of political realism as a geopolicy. And I think that the problem with the idealists is that they fight for goals that are unachievable, like a war to make the world safe for democracy, a war against terror. These are wars with no end goal. There's no way you can say, okay, the war's done, we've won. It's this open-ended, imprecise, vague objective. Whereas Kennan, representing the realist school, one could even argue Brzezinski and Kissinger as well were realists. We're fighting for practical, realistically achievable goals. Furthermore, he understood that with the Russians, whether they're Soviet or some other regime, you have to have a little bit of give and take. I think that's one of the problems of U.S. policy in the first half of the 20th century. It was winner take all. And of course, by eliminating Austria-Hungary, it created a power vacuum in Central Europe. By eliminating the Ottoman Empire, it created a vacuum in the Middle East, which created instability, which is ongoing now. The 1990s conflicts in Yugoslavia, the conflicts in the Middle East, are all the result of the power vacuum that resulted from World War I. World War II, right? There's a power vacuum in the middle of Europe with Germany. There's a power vacuum in Asia with Japan. And so the communists fill that vacuum. That's just not good long-term policy. Whereas more modest objectives, as Kennan would have advocated, lead to more long-lasting, substantive gains.
but in the end, we made the world safe for democracy. America, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well,
No, not serious.
no, but yeah, I do love Kennan, especially his 1950s lecture / essay, American Diplomacy, where he
Also,
made,
sorry.
well, just the main point there in American Diplomacy is that which was 1950 during the height of the Korean War. He basically admits that American policy, since the open door policy towards Korea, was just one train wreck disaster after another, because it was based off of idealism. It wasn't based off of practical, real world objectives, but idealistic, pie in the sky objectives.
So, I saw you commented on my video about America's maritime strategy. What was you want to go over with your disagreements in the second half?
Yeah, so the first half, he's absolutely right. The naval powers of Holland, Great Britain, and the United States, and for a brief time, you might have even included Japan, say from 1870 to 1945. Um, that is probably one of the most successful grand strategies in history. I mean, England in 1588, took on the Holy Roman, the Spanish Empire. I think your author misread Kennan. If you read American Diplomacy, Kennan doesn't really support he's heavily critical of the implementation of U.S. policy in Europe leading up to 1950. And taking out Japan was a complete disaster, which up until 1939, or 37 rather, when Japan invaded China, Japan was essentially a Western power that modeled itself after the United States. When Japan modernized in the Meiji Restoration, it modeled its constitution after the U.S. Constitution, its navy after the British Navy, and its army after the German army. Up until 1920, it was an ally of Great Britain and was still generally friendly towards the West. The main reason why they wanted to keep troops in China was to contain communism, which, in light of the Cold War with conflicts in Korea and Vietnam, was not an unreasonable concern for the Japanese to have. And as Kennan points out in American Diplomacy, Japan was containing communism in Korea and China as we were in 1950. So why not let Japan do it instead? They want to do it. They're able to do it. So why take on something that we don't need to take on? It's just a waste. And then in Europe, the mishandling of the two world wars led to the Soviet hegemony over Eastern Europe and a global threat, which neither Germany nor Japan were capable of representing. So I think that the U.S., the mistake was not waiting too long to get involved in World War I or World War II, as the author of that essay, or you were reading a chapter from a book. So as the author of that book would have stated.
God and Gold by Walter Russell Mead. You heard that name before?
I have not heard of him. The mistake was to get involved in the first place. Germany, Japan, the United States, and Great Britain should have just followed the Oracle of Delphi's advice to the Athenians: hide behind their walls of steel. Eurasia is never going to invade a combined Anglo-Japanese-American naval presence. The three great naval powers could just hide behind their wall of steel and monopolize markets in South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And then, Germany, Russia, and China can just blow each other up, and who cares?
Man, imagine having that type of thinking in Washington right now.
Actually, look, the United States produced more tonnage and shipping than all combatants in World War II put together. So there's no way anybody's going to invade the United States. And local naval superiority can be maintained by the British and the Japanese. So in 1910, we were all friendly to each other. Japan and the United States had some friction in the Pacific, but there's no reason why long-term strategic alliances could not have been struck at the time.
Also, on the author Walter Russell Mead, actually, I think you'll like him, but you probably will have disagreements with him. Obviously, I think you should buy a book called "Special Providence: How U.S. Foreign Policy Changed the World," where he gives out four, as he puts it, four different schools of thought. You have the Hamiltonians, the Wilsonians, the Jeffersonians, and the Jacksonians. It's a really good book. You may not agree with all the assessments, but it's a good book covering America's approach to the world.
Yeah, sounds interesting. I think at this point, since we're nearing the end of the hour, it's probably best to wrap it up. I'm more than willing to have any future discussions on other topics that you have in mind. Do you have any final statements you'd like to leave us with?
Okay. In summary, the 1960s were bad, and everything afterwards were kind of bad. So we need to change things for things to even get worse.
Well, there you go. I think that's probably about as concise and accurate as it can get. The 1960s bad, yo. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.
Peace.